I was 80 years old the morning I found out I had been dead for 11 days. There are certain sentences a person never expects to think, much less understand. That was one of them. I was sitting at my desk in the spare room, the same gray metal desk I had brought home when the county updated their furniture back in 2007. It had outlasted every trend in office design and, in many ways, most of the people I had worked with. It was not elegant, but it was dependable. Like most things I kept. My reading glasses were perched low on my nose. A cup of coffee sat to my right, cooling faster than I intended to drink it. The morning had been ordinary, the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself as important. And then the notification came. A small sound. A quiet interruption. A message from a woman named Pet Sims. She wasn't close family. Not even what I would call a friend in the traditional sense. She was part of the church's online group. One of those steady presences who attended regularly, spoke kindly, and kept track of things. People like Pet notice details. And sometimes they decide not to ignore them. Her message began carefully, the way people begin when they know what they're about to say may land badly. She wrote that she didn't quite know how to bring this up, that something had been circulating, that she thought I deserved to know. And then she attached it. My obituary. I did not react immediately. That is something worth understanding about me. For 34 years I worked in records, county documentation, filings, probate paperwork, legal submissions. I spent decades reviewing documents not for what they said, but for what they revealed. You learn in that kind of work that reacting too quickly is how mistakes get made. So I placed both hands flat on the desk. And I read. Carefully. From top to bottom. My name was correct. My photograph, the Christmas one from 4 years ago. Red cardigan. Pearls. Taken by Pamela. The date of death was listed as 11 days prior. I read the language. Then I read it again. It wasn't grief that settled over me. It was recognition. The phrasing was generic, respectful but distant. The kind of wording used when someone is working from facts rather than familiarity. Devoted mother. Faithful member of her community. Remembered for her quiet generosity. None of it was false. But none of it was personal. That told me something immediately. The person who wrote it did not know me well. But the person who commissioned it did. Then I noticed what was missing. No funeral service. No location. No funeral home. No instructions for flowers. No mention of donations. No timeline. Nothing that would guide grief. Because grief wasn't the purpose of this document. Movement was. I leaned back slightly in the chair. That was when I understood. This wasn't about burying me. This was about using me. I did not call Pamela. That is important. Most people would have. But most people do not spend 34 years learning how fraud presents itself on paper. I stood up instead. Walked to the closet. Took out a manila folder. Returned to the desk. And in the same block lettering I had used for decades, I wrote a name on the tab. Naen Brewer. Then I printed the obituary. All 6 pages of it. Clipped them neatly. Placed them inside. And set the folder in front of me. There is a particular kind of calm that comes from recognizing a pattern. Not liking it. Not accepting it. But understanding it. I had seen documents like this before. Not identical, nothing is ever identical, but similar in intention. They begin small, plausible, quiet, and then they move. Through systems. Through offices. Through people who assume the document is legitimate because it looks legitimate. That is how things get transferred. Accounts. Property. Authority. All of it begins with paperwork. I poured out the cold coffee. Made a fresh cup. Sat back down. And began building the record. First I wrote down what I knew. Date received. Source Pet Sims. Attachment. Obituary. Printed copy included. Then I began the list. Who had seen this? Who had been told? Where had it traveled? Because information like this does not sit still. It moves through networks. Church groups. Family circles. Old colleagues. Neighbors. People who knew your name well enough to believe it. I worked outward methodically. The pastor. Regular members of the church group. Pamela's extended connections. Her husband Douglas's family. Old acquaintances. Anyone who might accept the news without question. I wrote each name carefully. Because a proper list is the beginning of a proper record. And a proper record is what survives when someone tries to rewrite reality. Then I stopped, and I thought about the silence. 7 months. That was how long Pamela had not called. I had believed, quite reasonably, that it was distance after disagreement. We had argued in March. About the estate. About the land. About the account. Nothing unusual for a family if we're being honest. Money rarely introduces conflict. It reveals it. I had assumed she needed time. Time to accept boundaries. Time to adjust expectations. Time to come back when she was ready. I gave her that time. Spring. Summer. Even into fall. I had thought she was processing. Now I understood. She had been planning. That realization did not hurt the way you might expect. It settled. Quietly. Like a piece of information clicking into place. Because what Pamela had done, writing an obituary for a living person, was not impulsive. It required intention, selection, timing, execution, and above all, patience. I sat at the desk, folder open, pen in hand, and wrote the next line. Potential fraudulent sequence initiated. Then I picked up the phone and called the only person I trusted to handle what came next. Leonard Causey. He answered on the second ring. He always did. Reliable people tend to be predictable in useful ways. Leonard, I said, I need you to listen to something. And then I read him my obituary, from beginning to end, without interruption. When I finished, there were 4 seconds of silence. I counted them, because silence in legal conversations carries meaning. 4 seconds meant he was deciding whether what he heard was as serious as it sounded. At the end of those 4 seconds he spoke. Don't touch anything. I haven't. Don't call Pamela. I won't. Do you still have the original message? Yes. Good. Keep everything. I'll call you back within the hour. He paused, then asked very carefully, do you understand what this may be about legally? I adjusted my glasses, looked at the folder in front of me, and said, I processed probate filings for 34 years, Leonard. I understand exactly what it's about. He exhaled softly. Then you know what to look for. I do, I said. And I need you to find out what's already been filed. He called back in 52 minutes, not an hour, which told me he had found something quickly. And what he had found was enough. This wasn't just an obituary, he said. I know. There's movement. I expected that. 2 filings so far. Picked up my pen. Go ahead. And that was the moment my death became a case. Leonard did not rush his words. That is something I have always respected about him. People who rush tend to miss things. And when you are dealing with documents that are designed to move quietly through systems, missing something is the only mistake that matters. There are 2 filings, he said again, more precisely this time, both within the last few days. I wrote it down exactly as he said it. 2 filings. Recent. First, he continued, a petition submitted to Bibb County Probate Court. My pen paused for half a second, not because I was surprised, but because I was confirming that my initial reading had been correct. Go on, I said. It's tied to the 4.3 acres, he said, filed with an affidavit attesting to your death. There are moments when the body reacts before the mind does. Not dramatically, not visibly, but with a quiet shift in weight. I sat a little straighter in the chair. And the supporting documentation? I asked. The obituary. Of course it was. I wrote, affidavit of death. Unsupported. Obituary used as substitute. That alone told me everything I needed to know about the level of sophistication involved. This was not a professional operation. It was careful but not careful enough. Leonard continued. The filing is dated 9 days after the reported date of death. I underlined that. 9 days. They waited, I said. Yes. That wasn't hesitation, I added. That was timing. Agreed. There is a window in these things. A very specific one. If you move too quickly after a reported death, people question it. If you wait just long enough, the information settles. Becomes accepted. Becomes background truth. 9 days was not random. 9 days was calculated. What does the petition request? I asked. Initiation of transfer proceedings, Leonard said. Standard probate pathway, based on assumed death. I wrote it down. Transfer initiation, land asset. And the attorney? I asked. That one isn't in probate court, Leonard said. It's a written inquiry to the bank. Now that was important. Regarding the joint savings account? Yes. I closed my eyes briefly. Not out of emotion. Out of calculation. The language. I asked. Professional. Clean. Cites the obituary. Requests confirmation of account status and transfer procedure upon death of a joint account holder. Has the bank acted on it? No. That was the first piece of good news. Small. But significant. Banks are slow. It is one of their most useful qualities. They verify. They confirm. They require layers. And those layers take time. Time, in this situation, was everything. You caught this early, Leonard said. I didn't catch it, I replied. Pet Sims did. And you acted immediately. Yes. There was a brief pause. Both of those things matter, he said. I added another line to the folder. Window identified before completion of transfer. Then I clipped the page neatly behind the obituary. What's the status of the land filing? I asked. Initial stage only, Leonard said. Nothing finalized. No transfer completed. And the bank? Still in inquiry phase. No action taken. That meant one thing. We were not correcting damage. We were stopping it. I'll file a formal objection immediately, Leonard said. And notify the bank in writing that no transfer is to occur without in-person verification. Good. I'll also contact the Augusta firm. I considered that. Use the correct language, I said. There was the slightest hint of something in his voice when he replied. I intend to. People often misunderstand what correct language means in a legal context. It does not mean aggressive. It does not mean emotional. It means precise. It means using terms that carry weight in systems that recognize authority. Words like fraudulent misrepresentation, false affidavit, improper filing. Those words do not shout. They do not argue. They trigger consequences. I'll call you back once I've initiated everything, Leonard said. I'll be here, I replied. After we hung up, I sat for a moment. Not long. Just enough to transition. Then I turned to a fresh page in the folder and began documenting. 9:47 a.m. Initial call to legal counsel. 10:39 a.m. Confirmation of irregular filings. Details. Probate petition filed, land transfer. Affidavit of death. Unsupported. Obituary used as primary evidence. Bank inquiry initiated, joint account. I wrote everything. Because memory is not reliable. Records are. The folder was beginning to take shape. Wait. Structure. Sequence. That is how you fight something like this. Not with confrontation. With documentation. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and made another cup of coffee. Outside, the morning looked exactly the same. That is one of the more unsettling truths about serious situations. They unfold in perfectly ordinary settings. The yard still needed watering. The street was quiet. A car passed slowly. The kittened in Hayes boy, driving with the cautious focus of someone who understands the danger of what he's operating, but hasn't yet grown comfortable with it. I watched him for a moment, then turned back inside. Because inside, something very specific was happening. A system had been activated, using my name, without my consent. And now, another system was activating in response. I returned to the desk, opened the folder, reviewed everything again. Because before you proceed, you make sure you haven't missed anything. That is when I noticed something else. Not in the filings, not in the paperwork, but in the structure of the situation itself. Pamela had done two things simultaneously. She had created belief through the obituary, and she had initiated action through the filings. Most people only do one. They either lie or they act. Doing both requires a certain kind of thinking. A willingness to manage not just reality, but perception of reality. I had known for years that Pamela cared deeply about presentation. The Christmas cards, The coordinated photographs. The careful arrangement of how things appeared to others. It had always been controlled. Intentional. Almost admirable in its consistency. But this was different. This was that same instinct, applied to something that required more than presentation. It required restraint. And that she had not shown. I wrote another line in the folder. Subject demonstrates pattern. Presentation prioritized over verification. Then I sat back and thought about the next step. Not legally. That was already in motion. Personally. Because at some point, this would move beyond paperwork. But not yet. Not until the record was secure. Not until every filing had been addressed. Not until the system had corrected itself. That is the mistake people make. They rush to confrontation. Before the documentation is complete. Before the facts are fixed in place. Before the other side has lost the ability to shift their position. I was not going to make that mistake. By early afternoon, Leonard called again. "I've filed the objection," he said. "Good. Bank has been notified. Written instruction logged. And the Augusta firm?" A pause. I spoke to them. And they were not fully informed. I allowed myself the smallest nod. As expected. When they realized the situation, he continued, their tone changed quickly. Of course it did. They'll be reviewing their position. That won't take long, I said. Because once a lawyer realizes they've been handed false information, especially information tied to a death, they do not linger. They withdraw. Quickly. And carefully. The petition will likely be withdrawn within days, Leonard said. I'll note that when it happens. There was a brief silence. Then he asked, do you want to discuss next steps? Beyond correction. That was the first time the question had been asked directly. Not about fixing the problem, but about pursuing it. I looked at the folder, at the pages already filled, at the structure already forming, and I said, not yet, because the work was not finished, and I do not make decisions until the record is complete. The hardest call was not to my attorney. It was not to the bank. It was not even to Pamela. The hardest call was to Odessa. I sat at the kitchen table for nearly 15 minutes before dialing her number. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I understood very clearly what I might hear. There is a difference. Odessa Kimball has been my closest friend since 1971. We met at Second Baptist as young women, both newly married, both still learning the shape of the lives we were building. She married Harold. I married Darnell. And from that point forward, our lives ran alongside each other in a way that does not require maintenance. Some friendships are active. Ours was structural. 53 years. That is long enough to become part of someone's internal world. The way a person understands themselves. The way they remember things. The way they measure time. If the obituary had moved through the church group, and I knew it had, then Odessa had received it. That was not a possibility. It was a certainty. What I did not know was what she had done with it. I picked up the phone, dialed her number, and listened to it ring. She answered on the first ring, which was unusual. Odessa does not rush to the phone. She takes her time. Always has. Odessa, I said. What happened next is difficult to describe precisely. It was not a scream. It was not a sob. It was something that exists just before both. A sound that comes from the body when something it has already accepted is suddenly undone. She said my name. Once. Then again. Naen. And then a third time. Not as a question, but as a test. As if saying it again might confirm whether I was real. I'm here, I said. I'm on Oleander Street. I'm in my kitchen. There was a pause. And then, she began to cry. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But completely. I did not interrupt her. There are moments when words do not help. And this was one of them. I slid out of the chair slowly. Down onto the linoleum floor. Back against the cabinet under the sink. The way you sit when you need something solid behind you. She had been told 11 days ago. 11 days. She had believed it. Of course she had believed it. Why wouldn't she? The information had come through trusted channels. Church. Community. People who do not traffic in rumor. She told me what those 11 days had been. Not in order. Grief does not organize itself that way. It arrives all at once. She had rearranged a trip to Savannah to visit her daughter. Called her. Explained. Listened to her daughter cry on the other end of the line. She had told her grandchildren. Sat with them while they tried to understand what it meant. What it meant that someone who had always been there was suddenly gone. She had gone through my house in her mind, room by room, memory by memory, trying to hold on to things before they disappeared. That is what grief does. It compresses time, 53 years, into a single emotional moment. She had done all of that, quietly, without calling me, because calling me would have made no sense. She had carried it for 9 days. 9 days, before doubt began to surface, before someone noticed something wasn't right, before Pet Sims decided to ask questions. 9 days. I sat on the kitchen floor, phone pressed against my chest, and listened. There are things in life that anger you, and there are things that do something else entirely, something colder, more precise. This was not just about me. It was about what had been done to someone who loved me. 9 days of grief. That should never have existed. I did not raise my voice. I did not make any declarations. I did not say Pamela's name. But something in me shifted, because until that moment, this had been a legal problem, procedural correction, a matter of documentation and timing. Now, it was something else. When the call ended, I stayed on the floor. For a long time, the refrigerator hummed. A mockingbird outside moved through its entire repertoire, one call after another, as if nothing in the world had changed. Because nothing had, and everything had. I thought about Pamela. I thought about the choices she had made. Not just the act itself, but the sequence. Selecting the photograph, choosing the wording, deciding who to notify, and when, allowing the information to settle, waiting 9 days, then initiating the filings. That is not panic. That is not emotion. That is planning. Careful, deliberate, sustained. I tried briefly to find a place in myself where this was incomprehensible, where I could say, I don't understand how someone could do this. But I could not, because I had spent 34 years watching people do versions of this. Not identical, but recognizable. Documents filed with just enough truth to pass. Intentions concealed behind acceptable language. Processes used not to reflect reality, but to reshape it. What Pamela had done was not new. What made it different was that it was personal, that it was my name, my life, my death, and Odessa's grief. That was the part that remained, even after the legal pieces were already in motion, even after the corrections had begun. 9 days. I stood up eventually, went to the sink, ran water over my hands, then I dried them, walked back to the spare room, and opened the folder, because this also belonged in the record. Not the emotion, not the anger, but the fact. I wrote, contact Odessa Kimball. Confirmed, obituary received. And believed. Duration of belief 9 days. Impact. Personal grief communicated to extended family. I paused, then added one more line. Consequence extends beyond subject. Because that was the truth. This was not contained. It had moved. Through people. Through relationships. Through time that could not be returned. I clipped the page into the folder. Behind the call logs. Behind the legal notes. The record was growing. And with it, so was my understanding of what had actually been done. Later that evening, I sat in the kitchen again. Same chair. Same table. But the room felt different. Not unfamiliar. Just clarified. There are moments when a situation reveals itself fully. Not gradually, but all at once. This was one of those moments. Pamela had not just tried to move assets. She had created a version of reality and allowed people to live inside it. Even briefly. That has weight. I thought about calling her. Just once. Just to hear what she would say. But I already knew. Pamela does not react. She frames. She explains. She redirects. A conversation with her would not produce truth. It would produce positioning. And I was not interested in positioning. I was interested in record. So I did not call. Instead, I made a decision. A quiet one, but a permanent one. Everything, from this point forward, would go through Leonard. No direct conversation. No informal resolution. No opportunity for reinterpretation. Only documented communication. Because once something crosses into the territory of official action, you treat it officially. That is how you prevent it from happening again. That night I slept. Not easily, but completely. And in the morning, the process continued. I waited 3 days before calling Vernon. On the surface, that may seem like hesitation. It was not. It was preparation. There are conversations in life that do not allow for improvisation. Not because they are dramatic, but because they carry consequences that extend far beyond the moment in which they occur. This was one of those conversations. Vernon lived 20 minutes away. He called every few days. He brought groceries without being asked. He handled practical things quietly, the way men like him often do, fixing what needed fixing without announcing that it needed doing. By any ordinary measure, he was a good son, which is precisely why the question mattered. Before I spoke to him, I needed to understand what each possible answer would mean. Because once he spoke, whatever he said would not just describe the past. It would define the future. There were 3 possibilities. I wrote them down in the folder. Possibility 1. He knew about the obituary and said nothing. That would be a serious failure. Not of action, but of silence. Possibility 2. He knew about the pressure Pamela had been applying regarding the estate, and chose not to involve himself. A smaller failure, but still a failure. Possibility 3. He knew neither, which would not change the facts, but would change how I chose to proceed with him. I sat with those possibilities, considered each one carefully, not emotionally, but structurally, because emotion in situations like this tends to distort judgment. And I had no interest in distortion. Once I understood what each answer would mean, I picked up the phone and called him. I did not explain everything, only that I needed to talk to him, that it was important. He did not ask questions. He said he would come by. He arrived 40 minutes later, still in his work clothes. That told me something immediately. He had come straight from wherever he had been. No delay, no detour. He stood in the driveway for a moment before coming to the door, just long enough to gather himself, which told me something else. He knew this was not a routine conversation. When he stepped inside, I did not begin with explanation. I did not give context. I did not prepare him. I went to the spare room, took the obituary from the folder, and placed it on the kitchen table in front of him. "Read it," I said. Then I watched. There is a kind of shock that cannot be performed. It does not organize itself into expression. It does not reach immediately for language. Simply happens. That is what I saw. He read the first line, then the second. Then his eyes moved more quickly, then stopped. He did not look up. Not right away. He read it again, slower. And in that silence, I had my answer. He did not know. If he had known, there would have been something else. Some trace of preparation. Some attempt to manage his reaction. This was unfiltered. He sat there with the paper in his hands. For a long time. "I'm not dead," I said evenly. He looked up then, as if confirming what his mind already understood. "No," he said. "Just that. No elaboration. No attempt to soften it." Then he looked back at the paper. "Did you know Pamela was applying pressure about the estate?" I asked. That was the question I needed answered. More than the other one. He was quiet again. Not as long this time, but long enough. "She mentioned the land," he said finally. "In the spring." I waited. "Said it needed to be dealt with," he added. "I told her to leave it alone." He set the paper down. I didn't ask about it after that. There it was. Not involvement. Not agreement. But withdrawal. He had seen the direction things were moving. Had spoken once. Set a boundary. And then stepped back. Trusted that it would hold. That is a particular kind of failure. Not malicious. Not intentional. But real. The failure of someone who believes that saying something once is enough, even when the situation requires continued attention. The failure of someone who mistakes absence from conflict for neutrality within it. I looked at my son across the table. He was not defensive, not argumentative, not trying to reshape what he had done or not done. He was simply there, and he understood. That mattered. But it did not erase the fact that his silence had allowed space for something else to happen. I told him what Leonard was handling: the filings, the objections, the bank, the probate court. I did not go into unnecessary detail, only what he needed to know. You don't need to do anything, I said. Stay out of it while it's being handled. He nodded. That is how Vernon responds when something is settled. Not with words, but with acknowledgement. We sat for a while after that, not discussing Pamela, not discussing the situation further. He drank his coffee, quietly. Then he stood, walked out to his truck, and returned with the grocery bags he had left in the back. He had not mentioned them before, had not said he brought anything. He simply carried them in, set them on the counter. That is how Vernon expresses what he cannot say. Through action, not explanation. I watched him for a moment, then nodded once. He left shortly after. I stood at the kitchen window and watched him drive away. And I thought about what I had decided, because I had decided something. Not in that moment, but over the 3 days that had led to it. Vernon had failed, but not in the same way Pamela had. His failure was one of omission, not commission. He had not created the situation. He had not acted within it, but he had not prevented it either. And that distinction mattered. Believes that saying something once is enough, even when the situation requires continued attention. The failure of someone who mistakes absence from conflict for neutrality within it. I looked at my son across the table. He was not defensive, not argumentative, not trying to reshape what he had done or not done. He was simply there, and he understood. That mattered. But it did not erase the fact that his silence had allowed space for something else to happen. I told him what Leonard was handling: the filings, the objections, the bank, the probate court. I did not go into unnecessary detail, only what he needed to know. You don't need to do anything, I said. Stay out of it while it's being handled. He nodded. That is how Vernon responds when something is settled. Not with words, but with acknowledgement. We sat for a while after that, not discussing Pamela, not discussing the situation further. He drank his coffee, quietly. Then he stood, walked out to his truck, and returned with the grocery bags he had left in the back. He had not mentioned them before, had not said he brought anything. He simply carried them in, set them on the counter. That is how Vernon expresses what he cannot say. Through action, not explanation. I watched him for a moment, then nodded once. He left shortly after. I stood at the kitchen window and watched him drive away. And I thought about what I had decided, because I had decided something. Not in that moment, but over the 3 days that had led to it. Vernon had failed, but not in the same way Pamela had. His failure was one of omission, not commission. He had not created the situation. He had not acted within it, but he had not prevented it either. And that distinction mattered, not because it reduced the impact, but because it defined the response. I returned to the spare room, opened the folder, and documented the conversation. Contact: Vernon Brewer. Obituary presented in person. Reaction: immediate shock. No prior knowledge indicated. I paused, then continued. Admitted prior awareness of estate-related pressure. Spring. Action taken: verbal boundary set. No follow-up action taken. I added one final line. Assessment: failure of inaction, not intent. Then I clipped the page into place. The record was becoming complete, not just legally, but personally, because understanding what happened requires understanding who was involved and how. Later that week, Vernon returned. Without calling, he asked if I wanted to go to the Cherry Street Farmers Market. It was not something he had ever suggested before. He is not a man who fills time with outings. But I understood what the offer meant. It was not about the market. It was about presence. We walked for an hour, bought onions, looked at honey, talked about his work. He carried the bag. Without being asked, we did not discuss Pamela. We did not revisit the conversation. But something was being built. Quietly. The way a record builds. One entry at a time. By the second week, I had read the obituary 5 times. That is not excessive. That is method. When a document becomes central to a matter, legal or otherwise, you read it until it no longer produces new reactions. Until every word has been accounted for. Every omission understood. Every intention inferred. The 5th reading was different from the first. Not because the document had changed, but because I had. I sat at the gray desk in the spare room, glasses on, pen in hand, folder open, and I read it the way I had read thousands of questionable filings across 34 years. Not for what it said, but for what it was designed to do. The photograph. That was deliberate. Pamela had dozens of pictures of me. Recent ones. Casual ones. Less formal ones. She chose the Christmas photograph from 4 years ago. Because it presented well. Because it conveyed dignity. Because it would not invite doubt. A poor photograph raises questions. A good one suppresses them. She understood that. The language. Generic. Measured. Careful. Devoted mother. Faithful member of the community. Quiet generosity. Not inaccurate. But not specific. That told me the writer had been given facts, but not familiarity, which meant Pamela had either written it herself or provided the outline for someone else to fill in. Either way, she controlled the structure. Then there was the list of survivors. Her name, Douglas. The grandchildren, no Vernon. I had thought about that omission carefully, more than once. There were 2 possible reasons. The first, she expected Vernon to be manageable. To accept a corrected version later. To remain quiet. The second, she knew Vernon might question things. Might notice inconsistencies. Might disrupt the sequence. Both explanations could exist at the same time. And I believed they did. But the most revealing detail was not what she included. It was what she left out. No funeral. No service. No location. No instructions. That was the document's weakest point. Because grief, real grief, produces logistics. People want to know where to go, what to do, how to show up. The absence of those things creates friction. And friction leads to questions, which is exactly what happened. Pet Sims noticed. Others noticed. The document had done its job legally, but failed socially. And that failure created the opening that stopped everything. I turned to a fresh page. Drew 3 columns. What it stated. What it omitted. What the omission was meant to prevent. The 3rd column was the longest. Because intention is always more complex than presentation. I clipped the page into the folder. By the end of that week, Leonard's letter had gone out. It was precise. Direct. Unmistakable. The phrase fraudulent misrepresentation to a court of law appeared more than once. Within days, the probate petition was withdrawn. Not slowly, not reluctantly, but quickly. Leonard used the word precipitously. In his vocabulary, that meant one thing. The attorney in Augusta had realized what she had been handed and wanted distance from it immediately, which told me something else. Pamela had not fully informed her own lawyer. She had managed the presentation, but not the disclosure. And in legal matters, that distinction matters. The bank was simpler. I went in person, presented identification, provided Leonard's letter. The branch manager, Priscilla, handled it with professional neutrality, but I recognized the tone. She had seen something like this before. Not identical, but similar enough. Everything is in order, she said. I expect it will remain so, I replied. We understood each other. The land required more steps. Formal objection. Notarized affidavit. Verification of life. Correction of record. 2 weeks later. It was resolved. The 4.3 acres remained exactly where it had always been. In the proper sequence. On the proper timeline. Not accelerated. Not altered. Correct. That is the word that matters most in records work. Not winning. Not proving. Correct. By the 6th week, the file was complete. Every document accounted for. Every irregularity corrected. Every action dated. Nothing missing. Nothing out of order. I sat at the desk, closed the folder, and knew that anyone who opened it would find exactly what they needed, and nothing they could challenge. That is what a complete record does. It removes ambiguity. Leonard asked me one final question. Do you want to pursue this further? He did not need to explain what he meant. Legal consequences. Charges. Formal action. I considered it carefully. Pamela's actions were serious. There was no question of that. But consequences come in different forms, and not all of them require escalation. I thought about her, not as she was now, but as she had been. Organized, precise, focused on presentation. That quality, over time, had turned into something else, something that prioritized control over truth. She had not set out to create chaos. She had set out to manage an outcome, and miscalculated badly. The record now contained her attempt, the withdrawn filing, the objection, the correction. Anyone who looked would see it permanently. That was consequence enough. The record is accurate, I said. That's sufficient. Leonard nodded. He understood. I drove home slowly that day, took the longer road. October light through the trees. Low, golden. No urgency, because the work was done. Vernon came by twice that month. Once with groceries, once to clean the gutters. He stayed for coffee both times. We did not discuss Pamela. We did not need to. He was building something. Quietly. Consistency. Presence. The kind of record that does not require documentation, but accumulates anyway. Odessa came every Thursday, as she had since that first call. We talked about ordinary things. Grandchildren. Church repairs. Recipes. Once, we talked about the 9 days, and she laughed. Of course you were making a list, she said. Of course I was. Because that is how I understand the world. Through order. Through structure. Through record. In November I cleared the spare room, kept the desk, removed the boxes, set up the sewing machine properly. I had been thinking about making something. A quilt. Warm colors. Something that belonged in that room. Because I chose it. Because I made it. Because I decided where it belonged. The folder went into the filing cabinet. Between house insurance and Darnell estate settled. Labeled. Naen Brewer. Probate correction 2024. Complete. Accurate. Final. I do not discard records. I never have. They remain. As long as they are needed. And after that, they pass on to whoever understands what they mean. The morning is quiet again now. Coffee on the counter. Biscuits ready for the oven. Odessa will be here at noon. And everything is exactly where it should be. I was declared dead. And I corrected the record. Not with noise. Not with confrontation. But with patience. With structure. With truth. Documented properly. And that is something no one can undo.